Hello, and welcome to Of Significance, the podcast about what's relevant, what's important, and what's meaningful. It's where we address whether the numbers and analytics we see daily are incredibly useful or nearly insignificant. I'm your every person host, Brent Buckwright here, with experienced experts who have been analyzing big data since before it was big, and the inventors of the hit TikTok dances, the correlated error shuffle, the two-step wise regression, and of course, the sensational dance they performed on The Tonight Show with Jimmy Fallon, the random walk. Steve, Nathan, how are you?
Doing great, Brent. I like that introduction.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm also doing great. What is TikTok?
Great. We are in the thick of summer, which means people are grilling, the beaches are busy, and social commentators are looking for a seasonally appropriate economic issue to worry about. But we're made in the shade because a perennial favorite topic, what's wrong with the youth, has come roaring back. It makes for some classic hand-wringing as people wonder, are the kids these days working enough? Steve, you've been around since statistics were invented. Just to get the highest level view, what is the youth employment rate now? Why would we look at the employment rate versus the unemployment rate? And how does all that compare to historical trends?
The youth employment rate right now is about 35%. It's about the same for young men and young women, which is something that's been true recently where those two rates are about the same. If you go back, the young men used to be working at a higher rate than young women. I think the reason why we don't look at the unemployment rate is because one of the conditions for the unemployment rate is that you're like searching for work, and that's going to happen. I think more for people that have had a job, they're out of school, and so there are a lot of other things that young people could be doing other than work, which is attending summer school or studying for college entrance exams and things like that. So the employment to population ratio, that 35% number, is generally the thing that we would look at. And while the unemployment rate for some youth can be pretty high, it can be also a kind of a noisy measure of their inactivity.
So 35% doesn't seem like a whole lot, but of course there's all the conditions you listed on why that might not be anywhere close to the same as adult employment. How does that compare to anything we've seen historically? I mean, go back and as far time as you can.
Well, we really started measuring this right after World War II. So if we go back to like the 1950s, teens were working much more, especially the young men. They probably 2 out of 3 young men who are teenagers were working in the summer months, and it's kind of gradually gone down. It has gone kind of up and then down for young women. Probably the peak overall of teen employment was in the late 70s. That's when the rates were still pretty high, 60%, and they weren't that different between men and women. And then since the late 70s, it's kind of trended down until maybe the last decade or so.
So if I could, would you guys like to wildly speculate about why there's been such a dramatic change in the youth employment rate over the past 15 years or since it started to trend upward, I guess?
Yeah, sure. I'm always happy to wildly speculate. I think the part of it just has to do, and Steve maybe alluded to this earlier, there's a little bit of a trade-off between, I want to make some money over the summer. I want it for my own purposes. I want to alleviate the stress maybe on my household finances, versus I need to get into a competitive college. I need to do certain extracurricular activities that may not be compensated, internships that are unpaid, studying for exams, doing other kinds of things that are going to make me a more competitive candidate for college. So I think that's a big part of it. And, one of the things is, as we were kind of thinking about this, I was shocked to find out, because I was a youth in the 90s, that apparently there's 2 times more homework now than there was back then. I thought we did a lot of homework back then, but apparently my kids are going to be doing a lot more homework than I was. And so people are busier with school-related activities than I think they were, and maybe don't have the flexibility to take on that employment opportunity.
Yeah, I think there are 2 things here, really. One is what happened leading up to, like, let's say 15 years ago, which of course 15 years ago was like the Great Recession. So that's a complicating factor. But things were kind of trending down, I think, for all the reasons that Nathan was saying. There's just other ways that you could be investing in your human capital other than just getting this kind of work experience, especially for as college attendance rates are going up, and even some people that are going to junior colleges, even not a 4-year college, they're could be doing things in the summer to help prepare for that rather than taking jobs. But in the last 15 years, wages have really gone up for teens, like higher than for many other groups. They've gone up, way faster than the rate of inflation. So that would be what we'd call like a real wage increase. And I think that's drawing more teens to get jobs in the summer, and maybe they're better jobs or different jobs than they used to be. And so, I would always go to supply and demand as possibly a reason why we're seeing what we're seeing. And so I think the increase from like 30% 15 years ago to 35% now, it could be driven by these higher wages.
I want to jump in there real quick and just ask Steve, as a University of Chicago representative on the show here, that some of those higher wages probably have something to do with increasing the minimum wage rate. Am I right about that?
That would be possible if we're talking about state minimum wages, but this has happened with growing real wages while the federal minimum wage has been sitting there at $7.25 since 2009. For 15 years, no increase in the federal minimum wage. Yet, real wages of teens have gone up really at some of the faster rates that we've ever seen, especially relative to inflation. Now, we've seen like many different states adopt state minimum wages, so we'd have to study that why the wages went up, but it's certainly not due to the federal minimum wage.
So it seems like I should get one of these teen jobs. They seem like they're doing pretty great. I don't know.
Well, I think the average now nationwide for teenagers is about $14 an hour.
Okay, well,
so they're not
I take
that great,
I take that back.
It's up quite a bit from.
But if that continues forever, then
exactly.
you just keep adding.
Right.
Are there particular areas where you see faster growth relative to others? I mean, I assume that teenagers are mostly just working in fast food places and grocery stores.
I would say that where the jobs are primarily are where they have always been, which would be in what we would call kind of leisure and hospitality as a sector. And that would mostly be restaurants, could be fast food restaurants. You could be like a waiter, waitress, hostess, or host at the restaurant. There's cashier positions, retail, trade. Those are where a lot of them are. Not as many in like construction or those areas where I think if you go back in time, there might have been more jobs and those kind of things for teens and young adults. But it's kind of where you would expect. That's where most of them are. But I think there's a greater variety of jobs now too that teens, and like Nathan was talking about in terms of paid internships, that's going to cut across a bunch of different types of businesses.
Sure, the number of influencers that could possibly exist has exploded.
Yes, exactly. I think it's harder to pick up those certain kinds of jobs in the surveys that we're talking about. The way these surveys work is like there's going to be an adult who's answering for the entire household. So whatever answer you're getting on what kind of job the teenager is holding, it's not really a response from the teenager. It's going to be, presumably from their parents or something like that. So that would be a possibility that we're missing out on all the influencers who are out there in these teen employment numbers.
Yeah, because the parents have no idea what their kids are doing.
You don't have any idea, Nathan, do you?
So I love that we wildly speculate. I feel like that's in our wheelhouse. We know how to do that, but we also know how to look at real numbers and studies that people have done. Is there anyone who's actually tried to research details about this in some comprehensive way? Perhaps one that could get peer reviewed and published in a major economic journal. Does that exist? Or am I barking up the wrong tree?
Yeah, I don't know about a major economic journal. I wouldn't judge these outlets, but yeah, there's definitely peer reviewed research out there. I think a lot of it is aimed at kind of a policy evaluation kind of angle where you're saying, look, certain cities have investments in these kinds of programs. They're targeting, yeah, well, usually all kids of a certain age are eligible to participate, but they're really trying to make sure that they have positive outcomes for youth that are probably more at risk. And so there are these evaluation type studies that look at whether or not the kids that participate in these programs have better outcomes, and the outcomes can be all over the place. They can be academic outcomes, they can be not interacting with the criminal justice system kind of outcomes. And I think by and large, although the studies are saying different things and to different degrees, by and large, I would say they are positive. So kids who participate in these programs are more likely to attend school on a more regular basis and more likely to graduate and less likely to drop out. There's other things as well, the building good habits and learning how to interact socially with people in a work setting. These are all kind of life skills that are helpful to people.
And I would add to that by saying, even if you take a step back from these policy evaluation studies, where the jobs are can be very concentrated spatially within the cities and the suburbs. And, if you're from a poor household, you don't necessarily have access to the transportation to get to the job. So there are going to be pockets where this problem is much more difficult to try to encourage young people uh, to get the kind of work experience that you would get in a summer job, because how are they going to get there? If you're
What
from
is
a
there?
wealthier
One eight seven
family,
seven cars for kids.
yeah,
Can they?
like wealthier families are going to have multiple cars, and they're have better access to that kind of transportation. A lot of times, the work hours are going to be something where it'd be hard to fit into that. So I do think that it is a challenge in some of these instances to really try to connect the youth with the jobs. But I do think that it does help you, like I said, develop this human capital. It's not the same kind of thing that you're acquiring that would necessarily pay off in college, although it could be. But it's just getting you familiar with the world of work and what it means to have a job and be responsible and all that. So
Building
it
good
can be very
habits.
useful. Yeah, building good habits, exactly.
So, how exactly do those studies work?
Well, one of the studies that I enjoyed taking a look at was somebody by the name of Alicia Sasser Modestino, who's at Northeastern, and she's looked a lot at youth summer employment programs, especially in Boston. And Boston's got so many applicants that they can't accept everybody, and so they randomly select the people who can participate in the program and the people who can't. And so what's nice about that, and I think Steve's talked about this on previous episodes, is you've got a built-in kind of experiment. Everybody who applied had at least some motivation to apply, so they were all kind of motivated to participate in the program. Only some could do it, so then you can actually do the study of the people that took part in the program compared to the others who wanted to but couldn't. And she found pretty good evidence of some of the things I was talking about earlier, that attendance was up, and you're more likely to graduate from college. I mean, excuse me, from high school. So some of those outcomes I think are pretty well demonstrated from that particular study because of that, closer to a pure kind of randomized control trial than most things we get to see.
Yeah, and I think that one of the issues here is, like, there have been studies that show, if you're looking at something like scholarships and student aid, let's say in college, and how do students do if they're working their way through college versus they have that aid. Now, the student that is going to take on that extra responsibility of having the job, you'd think, well, that's more demands on your time. You can't do as well as you would have if you didn't have to take on that responsibility. But when you don't have a randomized control trial, you're just comparing the students who are in school, who are working their way through school, let's say in college, or it could be in high school, but most of the studies I've seen are for college, and those who don't. Well, if you know you're struggling in school, let's say in college, and you don't take on that job. And so you're not really comparing people with the same level of ability or the same initiative necessarily. And so when you look at those kind of correlations, or not causation, then you can be conflating with having the job with this unobserved factor, which is very hard to actually quantify, which is how motivated, how much drive does this person have. But in the study that Nathan's talking about, everybody who tried to get into the program presumably had, similar amounts of motivation. So when you compare the outcomes of those who got into the programs and those who didn't, that is as close really in social science studies as you can often get to, comparing a treatment group to a control group, a group at the placebo in actual randomized control trials. So I think it's probably the strongest evidence that you're going to have from a study like that. Again, it's hard to run experiments on people in a social science setting. So you have to look for those opportunities where you can make those inferences.
So in our last little bit of time, I want to do a little bonus segment. Summer jobs. Did you ever have one?
Oh, yes. It was like one of the best jobs I've ever had in my life. Was working in a grocery store. Now, the main reason was when I first started there, it was way long time ago, and we used to be able to burn stuff in the incinerator.
Wow.
Which was so fun, especially if there were some damaged grocery items.
Sure.
Throw them in there and see how they...
You'd accidentally knock over a jar of pickles or whatever.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Always accidentally.
It's been a slow week.
Right.
The cereal box aisle fell over.
And then...
to the incinerator.
We got the box smasher, which anyone who's listening who used to watch the David Letterman show back in the day, he used to smash things. And that was fun too, to smash items in there. But seriously, there were other good things about the job.
That monster Upton Sinclair wrote his book saying that's dangerous working conditions for...
Yeah, I mean, some of the things that you'd smash would really make a mess. But seriously, the thing that it got me really interested in economics back when I'm like 16 years old, because I had no idea, like, what does a grocery store pay for something? And then what's the markup? And I learned it's pretty low. And it's because everything they know how much to order. It's very predictable from one. They're probably like running regressions that I didn't know about, but it's pretty predictable. And so you don't have a lot, other than in produce, you don't have a lot of items that are wasted. And so you're just
until a young Steve Bronars is until wasting your pickle jar.
Things got knocked over. But
the incinerator Bronars,
the shrinkage. But so it got me interested. Like, how are these prices set? Why? Because if you're like a teenage kid, you don't realize how this whole thing works, and you realize, wow, these are pretty tight margins. You have to sell you got to move a lot of product before you make that much money, because it's like you're raising the price of these things, 5%, something like that, versus what you were 10%, what you're acquiring it from the wholesaler. So it got me thinking about a whole bunch of stuff, and probably got me started in studying economics. So,
Nathan, do you have a summer job origin story?
Yeah, that's fascinating, because I did a bunch of stuff as a kid that was what I would call kind of more informal, taking care of people's yards and mowing lawns and watering and cleaning pools and stuff like that. But the job that I remember that also I think had an impact on the way that I think about things even today was at a pizza place, where right out of the gates, the guy who was training me taught me about how to game the rounding system, making sure I clocked out to make sure it rounded up. And it struck me even then that I thought our computing was pretty good, and maybe you could just measure it to the minute, but or to the second even. But yeah, all these years later, we run into this in our work a fair amount of the time, that there's still rounding going on. And yeah, the managers did not have that. They were on top of people that were trying to game the rounding, but
that's a funny story, Nathan, because I had another job in a warehouse later, and there was this other guy that I worked with who was a college kid too. This is when we were in college, and it was in a warehouse, and the manager would stand there it was like an old style time clock, You don't even know what that is, Brent.
I know what a time clock is.
So, and the manager
It's a watch,
would
right?
Stand there, and I knew we started at 8:00 and
On a chain.
Yeah, right. And this guy who is a friend of mine, he'd like get in at like 8:07, and the manager was saying, "Are you sure? Got it close." And you'd always say that to the guy, because of course at 8:08, then he's going to lose 15 minutes. But he was trying to time it to get there at 8:07. Yeah, and I think the other ironic thing is that my kids, who are not teenagers, they're in their late 20s, they never really had the kind of summer jobs like Nathan and I did. So that's kind of what we've been talking about here. They did internships, volunteered, studied, summer school, and now, ironically, they're both getting PhDs in engineering, working on robotics to try to take away summer jobs from the next generation of people. So that's pretty cool.
I had a summer job also working for a pizza company, a pretty major one, and my job was I was helping identify potential instances of theft by managers. So basically, someone would order a pizza, and then the person who was getting the pizza would accept cash, but say that person canceled the order. And so they would have us call people to do like a customer survey and try and identify how the person was paid. And also all these other characteristics about like, how would you rate your experience type stuff. And we ended up, a manager actually got fired because he was stealing so much from the company. But he had a lot of people who were like, yeah, we accepted cash. And as a manager, it was weird for him to go give delivery rides himself. That's kind of interesting.
I think what I take away from this is that a young Brent would have been catching a young Steve or a young Nathan.
Well, that's been this episode of Significance. This episode's been brought to you by Edgeworth Economics, a leader in economic consulting, and with the help of our producers, Kimberly Krewald, Ryan Deal, and Brian McLamara of Brand Ready Media, with music by Armwell O'Lang. Thanks for listening, StatPack, and always remember to check your assumptions.